Welcome, everybody. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. My name is Doug Ferguson. I'm a senior program analyst with CMAP and the manager of the CMAC and TAP programs. I'm joined today by Kama Dobbs, also a senior program analyst and the manager of the STP program. We are joined today by a few other CMAP folks, John Hadsma, Mary Weber, and Sarah Stolpe, which are going to help moderate and answer questions and assist with any technical issues. Everyone is currently muted, and because this is a webinar, there is no chat function for attendees. But if you do have a question or a comment at any time during the webinar, please use the questions panel shown on the right-hand side of this slide with the red box around it to send your questions to staff. At the end of each section, we'll pause and give you a minute or two for verbal questions. All we ask is you to use the raised hand function button on the control panel that is circled in red. Let's test that now. If you can hear me okay, go ahead and raise your hand. All right, great. Looks like we've got a few hands raised. The last thing I wanted to note before diving in is that we are recording today's session, and we will post this recording along with the presentation slides and a log of all comments and questions that you submit on the Call for Projects webpage within the next couple of days, so probably early next week. So today's session is the first of two. And today's we'll cover an overview of the funding programs and the eligible projects. Next week we'll have an open Q&A session where you can virtually drop in at any time to ask questions between 1 and 3 on January 25th. All of the recordings will be available on the Call for Projects webpage, and that webpage is cmap.is /2023 Call for Projects. I'm going to post it here in the chat or the questions area for everybody to see, just in case that you didn't catch it on this slide. I would add, along with the recordings of today's webinar and next week's webinar, we've also posted a recording for the ETIP and how to enter a project. So that's available right now on the Call for Projects webpage for anybody that's interested. All right. I'm now going to turn it over to Kama, who's going to cover some of the basics here.
All right, great. Thank you, Doug. Good morning, everyone. As Doug mentioned, I'm Kama Dobbs, and I manage the STP program. During today's webinar, we'll describe the funding programs, eligible project types and requirements, the evaluation criteria, and our schedule. Before we dive in, just a little bit about why we're actually here. As the MPO for Northeast Illinois, CMAP is responsible for allocating certain federal funds directly to local transportation projects. CMAP solicits applications from local governments, highway and transit agencies for all phases of road, transit, and bike ped maintenance, modernization, and expansion projects, and applies scoring methodologies developed by our project selection committees to recommend programs of projects for funding. The scoring methodologies and program development are largely driven by federal requirements and the 3 principles of ON2 2050, which are inclusive growth, resilience, and prioritized investment. We program for 5 years at a time and cannot program more in any one year than is reasonably expected to be available in that year. Project applications are solicited through calls for projects every 2 years, and the goal of each call is to program the final 2 years of the 5-year programs and then to fill in projects in earlier years where funds may have become available due to project delays or just updated estimates of available funds in those years. This year's Call for Projects involves 4 federal funding programs: the Surface Transportation Program, or STP, Shared Fund, the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Improvement Program, known as CMAC, the new Carbon Reduction Program that was introduced with the passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and the locally programmed Transportation Alternatives Program, or TAPL. Let's first talk about the STP Shared Fund. The Shared Fund was established to fund regional scale projects that make large and lasting contributions. The Shared Fund targets road reconstruction or expansion, transit station, yard, or terminal improvements, bus speed improvements, corridor or small area safety projects, truck route improvements, rail highway grade crossing improvements, including grade separations, as well as the elimination of barriers such as roads, railroads, and bodies of water to bicyclists and pedestrians. Shared Fund projects are evaluated on their readiness, their transportation impact, planning factors, and sub-regional priority. To be eligible for the Shared Fund, projects must have a total cost for all phases from preliminary engineering through construction of at least $5 million. Lower cost projects are eligible if they are regional in nature because they're a partnership between 3 or more agencies, including at least one municipality. Partnership in this case means that all partners are participating financially in the project, not just providing letters of support. Shared Fund projects must also be included in an adopted local or regional plan, such as a municipal comprehensive plan, a sub-regional bicycle and pedestrian plan, a local or regional freight or truck routing plan. The application booklet provides guidance and many more examples of acceptable local plans, as well as contact information for CMAP planning staff that can answer project and plan specific questions. So what about existing projects? If you have a project that's currently included in the Shared Fund active program and a schedule change request is needed, you can just fill out a schedule change request form without submitting a new application. However, a new application should be submitted if you've got a cost change and would like to request additional funding. In that case, the currently programmed funds are treated as committed, and requesting any additional funds is what should be done. If not selected for additional funding, nothing about the project's current status will change. I do want to note that if a project is selected for additional funding for an already programmed phase, we might have to move those program funds to a different year in order to maintain fiscal constraint of the program. Projects that are currently in the Shared Fund contingency list or phases that are programmed in federal fiscal year 23 that may not meet their obligation deadline should also reapply at this time as if they were a brand new project. For projects that are partially funded in other programs, such as a local council STP program, or CMAC, or HSIP, those projects can submit a new application to fill in any funding gaps that exist. However, I do want to note that Shared Fund applications should not be submitted just to replace other committed funds.
The next program, CMAC, has been around since 1992. Those funds come to Northeastern Illinois because as a region, we don't meet federal air quality standards for ozone. Therefore, the program is focused on reducing ozone precursor emissions from transportation mobile sources. The program in Northeastern Illinois receives approximately $114 million each year. The types of projects that can be funded with CMAC fit into these 5 categories. Projects like intersection improvements, signal interconnects, bottleneck eliminations that improve traffic flow, or transit service and capital improvement projects, including operating funds for new service. Projects that directly reduce emissions through measures such as retrofitting existing diesel engines, repowering vehicles with cleaner engines, or replacing vehicles with alternative fuels. And then bicycle facility projects that can lead to shifting people out of their cars. And finally, other projects that result in emissions reductions or demos fit into the other or demo category. If you are considering a demonstration project, please reach out to me first, as there are several unique federal requirements that have to be considered with demonstration projects. There are also a few project types that are not eligible for CMAC funding. Included in this are projects that add single occupancy vehicle through lanes, or are requesting operating expenses for existing transit services, or projects that are considered routine maintenance, including reconstruction of roads, bridges, and stations, and basically in-kind replacements of roads or tracks or other equipment. Brand new for this cycle is a new federal fund source, as Kama mentioned, the carbon reduction funds. They were created by the IIJA in 2021, and a portion of Illinois' funding is being sub-allocated to Northeastern Illinois. The project types and the overall goal of CRP are nearly identical to the CMAQ program, and because of this, all applications submitted for CMAQ consideration will also be evaluated for CRP funding. The one major difference is that CRP is focused on reducing carbon dioxide emissions, which will be used in the evaluation of the applications, but all the other measures and criteria will remain the same as CMAQ. As you can tell, there's only approximately 18 million, which is significantly less than the CMAQ program overall. Finally, the last fund source is the transportation alternatives. The TAP program is focused on implementing ONTO 2050's recommendation to complete the Regional Greenways and Trails Plan by programming approximately 18 million per year for bicycle facilities. As with the CMAQ bicycle facilities, these projects need to be transportation oriented and not solely focused on recreational use. There are some common requirements for all three of these federal funding programs. I should say all four of these federal funding programs. Generally speaking, the project sponsors and the agency that will enter into financial agreements with IDOT or will be FTA grant recipients, and therefore must be a unit of government that can levy taxes. This includes state agencies, municipalities, counties, townships, park districts, and forest preserve districts, along with transit agencies. Within the STP shared fund only, non-municipal sponsors are strongly encouraged to partner with the municipality directly impacted by the proposed project. Within the TAP program only, IDOT is not an eligible sponsor, but is welcome to partner with other eligible sponsors. Private entities and nonprofits cannot sponsor projects directly, but are encouraged to partner with eligible sponsors. And when partnering with others on projects, one eligible sponsor will take the lead, and there should be an intergovernmental agreement between each partner and the sponsor for financial participation. In order to receive any of these federal funds, the sponsor must provide a minimum of 20% of the cost of each individual phase from a non-federal source. Each phase must be matched individually, so providing 100% local funding for phase 1 engineering, for example, does not reduce the match requirements for later phases. Examples of non-federal fund sources include motor fuel tax, Rebuild Illinois bond funds, state funds, and then local or regional programs like Invest and Cook, and even private funds can be used as match. Understanding the burden that providing providing a match can place on the region's highest need communities, the use of transportation development credits, known commonly as toll credits, is permitted in lieu of local match if requested at the time of application, and is only available to those communities that
highest need.
No, what's the word I'm looking for? No, the communities and community areas within the city of Chicago that are considered cohort 4 communities. There's more information on this and who is identified as a cohort 4 community or community area in Appendix A at the end of the application booklets. While talking about funding requirements, I also want to remind everyone that these are reimbursement programs. No funding is provided up front for engineering phases and for construction phases. And those are for engineering phases and for construction phases that are locally led. The project sponsor may pay all the costs and seek reimbursement from FHWA through IDOT or FTA. For construction projects that are led through IDOT, IDOT will make payments to the construction contractor and then bill the sponsor for their share. So that's something to keep and consider when putting together a project for consideration. We have some major changes related to the phase 1 engineering. So I want to call special attention to these next few slides. Across all programs, phase 1 or preliminary engineering is not eligible for funding, with the exception of cases for the highest need communities that are identified as cohort 4. These communities are, as I mentioned before, these communities are listed at the end of the program application booklets. In addition to being ineligible for funding, preliminary engineering must be underway prior to the March 10th application deadline in order to apply for any funding. The degree of completion of the preliminary engineering will determine what phases are eligible for funding consideration and will establish the maximum cost increase thresholds that can be considered for those phases in the future. This is a change to the prior policy, which required preliminary engineering to be substantially complete in order to apply for funding. One exception is signal interconnect projects eligible for CMAP funding do not typically require traditional phase 1 engineering, and these projects are ineligible for phase 2 engineering. The further along the preliminary engineering is, the more phases that are eligible for funding, and those phases will be eligible for larger future cost increases if needed. As long as preliminary engineering is underway, as defined in the application booklets, construction and construction engineering are eligible for funding. If preliminary engineering is complete, all remaining phases of the project are eligible for funding and may receive cost increases if needed in the future, up to 100% of the programmed funds. More discussion of this policy can be found in the SDP and CMAQ and TAP application booklets, in this SDP application booklet starting on page 12 and the CMAQ booklet starting on page 8. The degrees of completion of phase 1 engineering are defined as shown here and vary based on whether the project will be processed through IDOT, which is typical for road, bridge, and bike ped projects, or through FTA, which is typical for transit projects sponsored by the service boards of the City of Chicago. These degrees are linked to the NEPA processing for projects and are described in much more detail in the application booklets. Verification of the completion status will require applicants to attach certain documents, such as design approval letters, meeting minutes, or correspondence that document how the milestones have been met. Before we move on to talk about the evaluation criteria, are there any questions about the basic eligibility requirements? Let's start with the question box, and then if you have any other questions that aren't answered, we'll use the hand raised function to take those questions. Any questions that are specific to one of the fund sources we'll skip for now, and if those aren't answered in the presentation, we'll take them after the appropriate section. So John or Mary, could you read any of the questions that pertain to basic eligibility?
Not seeing any right now. We've just got a few specific ones that we're working to address.
Great, thank you,
It looks
Mary.
like actually one just came in. It says, if I have phase 1 complete, but I'm just getting into phase 2, then we would not be eligible for right-of-way.
No, actually, if you have phase 1 complete, you would be eligible for right-of-way.
Okay, and then the next question is, when will the degree of preliminary engineering be determined? Is that at the time of award?
No, actually, the degree of preliminary engineering will be determined at as of March 10th, the deadline for applications.
All right, thanks, Doug. Those were the only 2 questions right now. Just give it a second in case somebody's still typing.
right. If there's any other questions that someone would like to ask verbally, you can raise your hand and we'll unmute you and call upon you. So if you could do that here in the next couple of seconds.
Doug, while people are getting to the unmute button, we do have one more comment that came in, and that is the description of substantially complete and underway seems very similar. A NEPA determination cannot be made until all clearances are received.
Yeah, I think, it's a pretty fine line between substantially complete and underway. Substantially complete on the highway side would mean that the ESR review has been completed by the Bureau of Design and Engineering, and the preliminary PDR submitted, where underway would mean that that ESR review has started, but a PDR has not been submitted yet. On the transit side, it's the difference of, we've done scoping or started our draft environmental studies if there were unusual circumstances on a categorical exclusion. And again, going from kind of that early draft to I've actually put out a draft for comment. So it's a pretty subtle difference, but that is the difference that's intended. You're welcome, Madeline.
Looks like I've got one hand raised that I see. So let's see, Michael, Michael Horstein, you should be able to unmute yourself now and ask your question if you want to follow up. Let's see here. Oh, I think there you go. You're unmuted, Michael.
Yeah, no, sorry about that. I should have lowered my hand up. My question was answered with the degree of completion for engineering. So I'm good to go. Thank you.
Not a problem. Just wanted to make sure. Let's see. All right, I've got another question. I'm going to unmute. Okay, Richard, you should be able to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Good morning. Thank you very much. I had a question about in the application or in the packet materials here for the program, it talks a little bit about if phase one is not, basically near complete or complete when the funds are programmed. Is that applying just for this particular call? Are projects that are already in the program, are those grandfathered essentially?
Yes, those would be grandfathered, those existing projects. We can't realistically expect applications that were submitted prior without knowledge of this to abide by them. So this is only going to apply for this call and potentially future calls.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right, well, we'll have some time again at the end for any additional eligibility questions if you think of them as we're going through, but I'm going to move on for now and dig into how projects are evaluated for the STP shared funds. So the overall scoring matrix for the shared fund looks like this. It's not as scary as it looks on the screen, I promise. There are the four main categories that I mentioned earlier: project readiness, transportation impact, planning factors, and sub-regional priority. And those are kind of the light gray shaded lines shown on the screen. And then the criteria that make up each of those categories is shown below those headers. All projects can receive up to 100 total points, with the highest scoring projects being given first consideration for available funding. Project readiness is worth 15% of the total score, and it includes up to 10 points for completing phase 2 design engineering milestones and right-of-way acquisition, and up to 5 points for leveraging other available fund sources like local STP, CMAP, Invest and Cook, state funds, local funds, or private funds, anything that can reduce the STP share of the project cost. Transportation impact scoring, which is 50% of the total score, varies by project type and is divided into 3 subcategories: existing condition or need, improvement, and job and household impacts. In general, the existing condition scores are scaled within each project type based on the current condition that is germane to that project type. Improvement scores compare a project's potential to improve conditions relative to the total cost of the improvements. Finally, the number of jobs and households that can potentially benefit from a project is determined by using the regional travel model to generate the travel shed of the places that people come from and go to using the facility being improved. All of the jobs and households within the travel shed are added together and scaled to 10 points relative to all other project applications. Understanding that this is a competitive program designed to address very specific needs, any project that has a raw improvement score of 0 will not be considered for funding or inclusion in the contingency program. Likewise, projects must demonstrate need as appropriate for the project type in order to be eligible. For example, bicycle and pedestrian barrier elimination projects will not be considered if no physical barrier exists. Bridge projects will not be considered if their sufficiency rating is higher than 80, and transit station improvements will not be considered if the average term score is good or excellent. The thresholds for each project type are described in great detail in the application booklet. This table summarizes the factors considered for each project type to define existing conditions and determine the relative need for the project. As you can see, the factors are generally tied to performance measures like mobility, reliability, safety, and condition. And that could be the condition of the bridge, the pavement, or the transit facility. Likewise, the improvements considered for each project type are shown in this table. Within each project type, the cost effectiveness of the improvements are scaled relative to each other. Detailed definitions and scoring breakdowns for both the need and improvement for each project type are included in the application booklet. Planning factors, which make up 30% of the total score, evaluate the extent to which the project or sponsor supports a number of regional planning priorities, including inclusive growth, complete streets, multimodal freight movement, transit supportive density, and resilience. Resilience is new this cycle and replaces the previous green infrastructure factor. These factors and the maximum points for each varies by project type, but each project type can receive up to a maximum of 30 points from planning factors. The inclusive growth planning factor awards points to projects based on the percentage of users of the facility that are people of color below the poverty line. These points are predetermined based on the map shown here. The complete streets planning factor awards points if the jurisdiction where the project is located has a policy or ordinance supporting complete streets. Points are also awarded if the scope of the project includes complete streets elements such as sidewalks, bike lanes, multi-use paths, refuge islands, curb extensions, or pedestrian countdown signals, to name just a few on the list. Resilience has been added as a new planning factor this cycle. This replaces the green infrastructure factor. Like complete streets, there is both a policy and an elements part of the score. Projects are eligible to receive policy points if the local jurisdiction has an adopted policy with the goal of increasing transportation resilience. A green streets policy is one example of a resilience policy. Projects will receive additional points for including elements in the scope that improve the ability of the transportation asset, whether that's the road, the bike path, the transit station, to withstand one or more elements of a weather event or natural disaster, or to increase the resilience of the infrastructure from the impacts of changing conditions, such as flooding or extreme heat. Green infrastructure, flood control, and intelligent transportation systems, such as weather-responsive traffic management, are eligible elements. Gray infrastructure for stormwater storage, compensatory storage, drainage structure upgrades, and roadway relocation or elevation above flood level are considered eligible elements only if they exceed established design standards. Points for the freight planning factor are awarded to projects located on the National Highway Freight Network, or a designated Class 1 or 2 truck route, or an NHS intermodal freight connector. Additional points are awarded if the sponsor or local jurisdiction has freight supportive policies, if the sponsor completed freight-related studies, like a truck routing or truck restriction study, or if the project is included in a freight mobility plan. Finally, the transit planning factor awards points for projects located in areas where higher densities are allowed, innovative parking requirements exist, or mixed-use zoning exists. While the bulk of the scoring methodology that I've discussed so far addresses regional priorities, because our region is so large and so diverse, it's also important to recognize that the 12 subregions, which is each council of mayors area, as well as the city of Chicago, also have unique priorities. Because of this, each council and the city have an opportunity to identify their 5 highest priority projects from all eligible applications submitted for the shared fund. Those priorities are worth up to 5% of the total score and will receive the points shown here. Although it's anticipated that councils and CDOT will identify projects located within their own borders, regardless of the sponsor agency, as their highest priorities, they may also identify priorities outside of their borders when there is a clear justification of the transportation benefit to their residents and or to persons working or traveling within their subregion. Projects that are designated as priorities by more than one subregion will receive the combined points up to the maximum of 5. Before I hand this back to Doug to talk about CMAQ and TAC evaluations, are there questions about the STP shared fund evaluation process? Let's again start with the questions box, and if we have another question that isn't answered, raise your hand. John or Mary, could you read the questions that pertain to the shared fund?
Nothing new in the question box right now.
Okay. Anyone want to ask a question verbally? Just go ahead and raise your hand so that we can unmute. And I'll give everybody a second here. And I'm not seeing anything jump up right now. Again, we'll have a full chance to ask any random question at the end of the webinar today. So not seeing anything, I'm gonna let Doug do his thing.
All right. Moving on to CMAQ and CRP. So these two programs have 3 screening criteria. It must be a transportation project that has a demonstrated air quality benefit as estimated by CMAP staff. All bicycle facility applications must be found in an adopted or approved plan, and the project must have a realistic development schedule. And so projects not meeting these screening criteria will not be funded. Projects are scored on a 100-point scale, with the majority of points coming from the air quality cost effectiveness, and then 30 points are available from the transportation impact criteria specific to the project type, and 20 points are available from equity scoring. This is a change from past cycles, but we'll discuss those changes in just a few moments. So the air quality cost effectiveness is calculated by using the estimated emissions reduction and the total project cost. All project types except the direct emissions reduction projects the cost benefit is based upon the volatile organic compound emissions reduced. For direct emissions reduction projects, they're evaluated based upon a combination of particulate matter and nitrogen oxides emissions. And then for the CRP funds, we'll actually be looking at carbon dioxide emissions, which will be used for all applications. And then for the project costs, all costs associated with all phases of the project should be provided, even for those phases that are already completed or funding received outside the CMAQ or CRP programs, with one exception. If a project is being completed as part of a larger project, meaning like the total project cost may only be for the CMAQ CRP funded project if the project has independent utility. So like, let's take a bicycle side path project that is being completed as part of a larger roadway project. Only the costs associated with the bicycle facility are considered because the side path has independent utility from the roadway improvements. The cost effectiveness is reported as dollars per kilogram of either VOC eliminated or PM and NOx eliminated or CO2 eliminated. And then that is scored, I should have added, will be equated into a 50-point scale. For the transportation impact criteria, the scoring is based upon the project type, which is summarized here. And I'll go over each individually on the next few slides. For highway projects, we look at travel time reliability, which is worth 15 points, and is measured based upon the planning time index for the project roadway and the qualitative characteristics of the proposed improvement, such as inclusion of certain ITS solutions or elements that will improve incident detection and response, or or recovery, and are listed along with the point values in the application booklet. The safety score is calculated using IDOT's Safety Road Index, or SRI, for the roadway segments and the intersections of the proposed project. SRI is based upon the location's potential for safety improvement score, or PSI. Lastly, if the project is part of a corridor improvement, and if the project design and scope includes a transit improvement like TSP or Q jumps, dedicated bus lanes, fixed station or stop improvements, or pedestrian access to transit, it is eligible for corridor or transit improvement points to be awarded. For the transit projects, the first TIC is the ridership increase, which is the overall increase in transit ridership resulting from the project. Transit projects are scored either on travel time reliability, which is used for transit service projects and is composed of a quantitative measure of on-time performance on a particular route with a qualitative evaluation of the project's impact on reliability, which is described in more detail in the application booklet. For transit capital projects, we look at existing asset condition, which is based upon the condition of the asset being improved and uses the score from the RTA asset inventory. Finally, points are also awarded for transit supportive land use, as described previously by CAMA, and looks at density, the use of innovative parking requirements, and the presence of mixed use zoning around the project. Bicycle facility projects are scored on 3 factors. Safety and attractiveness compares the condition of the after improvement to the before condition. So the larger the difference between the conditions, the higher the score. The connectivity measures the connection to other bikeways or the level of traffic stress on the connecting roadways. And the highest of the 2 scores is retained between those 2. And finally, because measuring transit accessibility or availability helps ensure that a bicycle facility provides a realistic alternative to auto use by evaluating the potential to link bicycling with transit for longer trips. Projects receive higher points for our higher transit availability, which is an ONTO 2050 indicator and described in more detail in the application booklet. The direct emissions reduction projects receive 5 points if they are improving public fleets, and then receive 25 points based upon their benefit to sensitive populations, which is an index that looks at particulate concentrations in relationship to populations in a census tract that are either over the age of 65, under the age of 5, minority or low income. The last element of the CMAQ and CRP scoring is a modification of the last cycle's inclusive growth score. We've added the disadvantaged community measure to create an equity score. The inclusive growth is the same that was used for CMAQ and the SDP program, but we are awarding points to projects based on which is awarding points based upon the percent of users of the facility that are persons of color below the poverty line, and is calculated for both roadway users and transit line transit line users. The new disadvantaged community measure looks at the census tract where the project is located and uses USDOT's disadvantaged community tool to rate the number of categories that the census tract is found to have that are labeled as disadvantaged. There are a total of 6 categories that the tool uses, and for a project to receive points, it must have a minimum of 3 categories rated as disadvantaged. To receive the disadvantaged community points, applicants need to provide details in the application workbook on how the project will address equity in the area around the project. If a project exists in multiple census tracts, it will be given the points of the highest scoring tract. And if an applicant feels that a project is not properly evaluated by the DAC tool, they can provide evidence in the application workbook for why the application should receive disadvantaged community points, and staff will take it under advisement. More information can be found in the application booklet and on USDOT's DAC tool website, which a link is provided to in the application workbook. Our last funding program is TAP-L. To receive TAP-L funding, the project must be a bicycle facility that is transportation related and not solely recreational. The project also should be included in an adopt or approved plan and must also have realistic development schedule. Projects are scored on a 100-point scale, with 30 points coming from how the project helps completes the Regional Greenways and Trails Plan, 20 points from the population and employment density of the area around the bicycle facility, 20 points from the safety and attractiveness rating, which, like the CMAC and CRP bicycle projects, compares the after improvement condition to the before condition. And lastly, 20 points, or not lastly, but 20 points will also be awarded for equity, just like CMAC and CRP. And finally, there is 10 possible points for project readiness, which is awarded if right-of-way is not required or has already been achieved, or if phase 2 engineering is already completed. So before we wrap up with the application process and timeline, are there any questions regarding the CMAC, CRP, and TAP-L project evaluations? So John or Mary, let's start off with the questions in the question box before we go to people using the hand raise function.
Yeah, so we have a couple questions in the box here. The first one being are electric vehicle charging stations or electric vehicle purchases for fleets eligible under the CMAC or CRP funds sources?
Yes, so they are. Depending on what's being converted, the electric charging stations, if being done separately, should be submitted under the other category. But electric vehicles, and this is where it gets a little bit different, and there may just generally purchasing vehicles, like say for personal use or providing rebates for personal use, are not eligible under either CMAC or CRP. But if a municipality wanted to convert their fleet of vehicles to electric vehicles, those would be eligible under CMAC, but depending on the type of fleet vehicle that's being converted, there may be some differences between how much is eligible for funding. If it is transportation specific, and this may seem a little bit unusual, but like let's say it's a road maintenance vehicle, that would be transportation specific. It would be eligible for 80% of the EV vehicle cost. But if it's a general fleet vehicle, it may only be eligible up to 80% of the incremental cost between the EV vehicle and the regular vehicle purchase. So if there are any questions on that, please feel free to reach out to myself and we can work through the specifics of those.
Great, and then we have another one asking, would a cohort 4 community receive maximum inclusive growth points by default?
Not necessarily. It is based upon the users of the facility, of the existing facility. So if let's say we're looking at like a train station in a cohort 4 community, we would look at the ridership from that station. So that's how the inclusive growth points would be awarded.
And then lastly, right now we have one asking, do local bike and multi-use paths meet the criteria for projection being on a plan? Excuse me, project on a plan.
Not sure I'm understanding that question, and I don't want to guess. So hold on, let me.
We have a clarifying here, meant local plan. So.
So the plan requirement is very broad, and it could be a local plan. If a project is identified in the regional greenways and trails plan, that's a plan. It could be a sub-regional plan sponsored by a council of mayors. That would also be included. It could be a state plan. It could be a local comprehensive plan. So we're giving it a large breadth of what's considered a plan for the purposes of identification. And the project itself may not be called out specifically, like the actual specific locations, but if it says like the trail is in the southern portion of a community and there's a comprehensive plan that calls for improved bicycle conditions in the southern portion of that community, that would be considered meeting the plan requirement.
And that's it from right now in the question boxes.
Okay. And do we have any hand raised? I don't see any. So we're going to move on. And as Cam has mentioned several times, we'll at the end, we'll take all questions that come up that haven't been answered.
All right. So just briefly to go over the application process and timeline. Applications are submitted through CMAP's online ETIP database. ETIP gathers basic project description and the requested funding information. It provides a tool for mapping of the project location and provides a file uploader for attaching all documents related to the project application. A comprehensive user guide and pre-recorded training session for completing applications in ETIP are available on the Call for Projects webpage. In addition to the ETIP application, several attachments are also required, including the application workbook, which is an Excel file that asks in-depth technical questions specific to each fund source and project type, as well as a detailed cost estimate, a status update form, which details the project schedule and will be used for updates by sponsors quarterly going forward as selected for funding, and other forms that are required by project type, such as the input module worksheet for signal interconnects on the CMAC side.
Intersection
Improvements, darn it. All of the forms are available for download on the Call for Projects webpage, and completed forms should remain in their original file format, which is typically Excel or Word, and should not be converted to other file types like PDF. So it's extremely important that for the application workbook in particular, that remain in Excel format. We use scripting to pull those answers out into a master spreadsheet, and so saving it in another format means we have to retype all of your answers individually, and we don't want to do that.
And increases the likelihood of errors occurring if we have to retype something.
Yeah, what Doug's saying is we're not very good typists. So the general timeline for the Call for Projects is shown here. All applications are due by close of business, which is 5 p.m. on March 10th. Local project sponsors are strongly encouraged to save their applications as final within the ETIP database by February 24th. Applications that are completed by this date will be reviewed by the region's planning liaisons for completeness and potential errors before final submittal to CMAP. So local sponsors can then coordinate with their PL to make changes and add or update attachments prior to the March 10th deadline. For those of you that are at sponsor agencies that are not involved in the Council of Mayors system and don't have a planning liaison, March 10th is that final submittal date. From March through June, CMAP staff will complete project evaluation and scoring and will present staff recommended programs to the respective project selection committees on July 13th. A public comment period on the staff recommended programs will open that same day on July 13th and will close on August 11th. Staff will review the public comments, make any necessary updates to the recommendations, and present final programs to the project selection committees for consideration on August 31st. Those dates, of course, are subject to change, but that's the plan. Once approved by the committees, tip changes will be made for CMAP Transportation Committee consideration. Final approval of the programs will occur when the MPO Policy Committee approves those tip changes at their joint meeting with the CMAP Board on October 11th. So the best place to find the information you need to submit an application is on that Call for Projects webpage, which again is cmap.is/2023 Call for Projects. All application materials and forms, the recording, slides, and Q&A from today's and next week's webinars, as well as some frequently asked questions, can be found on this webpage. Local agencies are also encouraged to reach out to your planning liaison. Not only are your PLs experts on these particular programs, but they're also experts on the ETIP database and know much more about your local projects than CMAP staff does. And they'll be reviewing your applications before submittal to CMAP. So talking through the projects early with your PL is encouraged. Finally, we've reached that magic spot of, are there any additional questions? Anything's fair game here. So I think we've kept up with the questions box, but if not, please feel free to keep using that questions box or raise your hand to be unmuted at this time. I know we gave a lot of information today, and I definitely don't think that we've addressed everybody's questions, but it's also being put on the spot to ask your questions can be difficult. So that's part of why we're having the drop-in session next week on Wednesday. So Doug and I will be here on GoToWebinar from 1 to 3 next Wednesday, the 25th. So if you think of a question after going through reading the materials, feel free to drop into that session and ask that question. And I see a couple more are popping up here. So,
and one of them specifically is about the Q&A session. Yes, we will record that and make that available to review. Though, because it's drop-in, if people don't show up, there might be some dead air, or I think Cameron's promised that she might sing.
You do not want me to sing, but we may be able to provide some background music instead.
Yeah, and then the other question that just came in was, what does substantially complete mean to be eligible for land acquisition?
Substantially complete, the full definitions, Harry, to answer that question, are included in both application booklets. On the highway side, it means that your preliminary PDR or equivalent, if a full report isn't required, has been submitted to IDOT for review, and that the project has been through at least one state federal coordination meeting, and federal highway concurrence of environmental processing has been given, if required. That's not required for state approved CEs. And that the IDOT Bureau of Design and Environment has completed the environmental survey review, if that's required. So attachments to show that milestone has been reached means that you should be attaching kickoff meeting minutes, coordination meeting minutes, and the such. So a lot of details in the application booklet. And if that doesn't answer your question, let us know.
And then one additional question on the Q&A, can there be a summary document of questions and answers that can be released as well in addition to the video?
Yeah, we can try our best to incorporate the Q&A into the FAQs, and if we have some general ones that I think would be applicable to multiple sponsors, yeah, we'll try to summarize those.
Yeah, and before we close out the webinar session today, we'll put all of the answers that we've given verbally into this Q&A box, and we'll print a copy of the questions and answers that we received today as well.
So if anybody wants to ask a verbal question, you can also raise your hand. And we can unmute you and you can ask your question. If you don't want to type into the box. Not seeing anything. Just a couple pointers. Like one of the things that you have to do to submit your application is in the ETIP is don't wait if you don't already have a login for ETIP. Start that process sooner rather than later. It could take us, there's a whole step and procedure to requesting login for ETIP. And it could take us a couple of days to get you approved and going. So we don't want anybody to run into an issue where they waited until the last minute to start entering their application in. And that could be the reason why they weren't able to complete it. Plus, it'll give you an idea of what you have to, information you need to come up with to complete the ETIP by just taking a look at it. And applications can be started and saved and then gone back to and changed and updated. So it makes it a lot easier that way. And it can also be helpful when you have questions for your either planning liaisons or CMAP staff, if you can point to what you're talking about in the ETIP.
All right, well, on the screen again is the reminder for next week's Q&A session. And then just wanted to put up, again, that web address and both mine and Doug's email address on the screen. And I see one hand raised. Dave Tomczyk's hand is raised. Let me unmute you, Dave. Go ahead with your question.
Yes, Doug, I got a question on the carbon reduction program. So
Yeah.
Now when you, I guess, I don't know if I caught it, but if you submit a project for that specifically, or are you just going to look at that as part of the CMAQ money and determine which source would be the best if the project was?
Yeah. So all applications that select CMAQ as what they want to apply for will also be evaluated for the carbon reduction funds. Now the carbon reduction funding is much smaller amount than the CMAQ funding.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll just have to kind of pick and choose what we think based upon the carbon dioxide emissions, how they score in carbon reduction, and we may bounce around between the two when trying to assign which funding source works the best.
So for the sponsor side, we don't have to worry about what program we're applying for. It'll just be CMAQ, the process we follow.
Right. Yeah. If you want to be considered only for TAP, if you would all want to be only considered for TAP or STB shared fund, then you should just pick those. But if you select CMAQ specifically, you'll be evaluated for both CMAQ and CRP.
Okay. So the staff will determine on your end. We don't have to worry about that.
Correct. Yep.
Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. Dave, did you have another question? It looked like your hand went away when you came back.
This was really helpful.
All right. Yeah, not a problem. Not seeing any other hands raised. So please raise your hand, even if you want to type in, so that we hold off and we don't hang up here. But if there's no other questions, we're probably going to end the session here in a couple seconds. Not seeing anything. Mary or John, is there anything else in the chat box that we either didn't get to or missed?
I'm not seeing anything in the chat box, and I don't see any hands raised either.
Okay. Well, on behalf of Cam and myself, thank you for tuning into this. We're looking forward to some great applications being submitted for these funding programs. Hopefully, like, if you do come up with any questions, you'll join us next Wednesday evening or afternoon from 1 to 3 with those questions. And as we've said before, and we'll say again, also please reach out to your planning liaisons with either questions or get them involved early in the application process. Don't wait until the last minute. It makes their lives easier and probably leads to better applications on your part. So with that, thank you and have a great weekend.